There is a book, quiet in its pages, simple in its language, but so heavy in its truth that once you sit with it, something inside you shifts. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or revelations that shake the ground beneath your feet, but slowly, the way the first light of morning doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives, and suddenly everything looks different. That book is Life and Conduct by Samuel Smiles, and what it carries inside is something that every single person alive right now needs to hear. Samuel Smiles was not a man who wrote from an ivory tower. He was not a philosopher who spent his days theorizing about human nature from a comfortable chair in a warm library. He was a man who watched people, who lived among them, who studied the ones who struggled and the ones who rose, the ones who fell apart and the ones who somehow, against all the weight pressing down on them, managed to build something beautiful with their lives. And what he found after all that watching and all that living was not some complicated secret. It was something so plain, so honest, so deeply human, that when you hear it, part of you will want to laugh and another part will want to cry, because you will realize you already knew it. Somewhere deep inside, you always did. This is a summary of that book, but it is more than a summary. It is a walk through the ideas that Smiles believed could change a life, told in the way a friend would tell them to you, sitting across from you, looking you in the eye, not to impress you, but to remind you of something important. And if you stay with it, if you let these words land where they are meant to land, you might find yourself thinking differently about your mornings, about your habits, about the way you treat the people around you, and about the kind of person you are quietly, every single day, becoming. Let us begin with something that Smiles returns to again and again throughout the entire book, and that is the idea of character, not reputation, not what people say about you when you walk into a room, not the image you carefully present to the world, but character, the thing that remains when all of that is stripped away. Character is what you are when no one is watching. Character is the choice you make when keeping your word costs you something. Character is the patience you hold on to when everything inside you wants to snap. And Smiles believed, with everything in him, that character is not something you are born with or without. It is something you build slowly, daily, through the 10,000 small decisions that most people never think twice about. There was a man Smiles wrote about, a craftsman, not famous, not rich, not particularly well-educated, who had grown up in poverty so sharp it could cut glass. His father had left when he was young, his mother worked herself thin trying to keep them fed, and by the time this boy was 12 years old, he was working long hours in a trade that paid almost nothing. Every reasonable expectation for his life pointed toward more of the same, struggle, scarcity, a ceiling so low you could never stand fully upright. But this young man had something. Not talent, not luck, not a benefactor who appeared at the right moment. He had the habit of finishing what he started. Every single thing he began, he completed. A job given to him halfway through the day, done before the day ended. A promise made in passing, kept even when the other person had forgotten about it. A skill he decided to learn, practiced until it was no longer a skill but a part of him, and over the years, slowly, the way a stone is carved not by one dramatic blow but by water falling on it, drop after patient drop, this man built a life that no one looking at his beginning would have ever predicted. It was not magic. It was character, built one honest act at a time. Smiles talks about this as the foundation of everything else in the book. Before he talks about knowledge or ambition or success or relationships, he talks about character, because without it, everything else is a house built on sand. You can have intelligence without character and it will work against you. You can have opportunity without character and you will waste it. You can have love without character and eventually it will crack under the pressure of who you actually are when things get hard. Character is the ground. Everything else is what grows from it. And the way character is built, Smiles says, is through habit. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire book, and it is one that modern science has now spent decades confirming. The habits you practice every single day are not just things you do. They are quietly, without your permission, shaping who you are. Every morning you choose discipline over comfort, you are not just getting one thing done. You are casting a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. Every time you choose honesty when dishonesty would be easier, you are not just telling the truth in one moment. You are deepening a groove in your character that will make honesty come more naturally the next time, and the time after that. And conversely, every time you let yourself off the hook, every time you make the easy choice instead of the right one, you are also casting a vote, just in the opposite direction. Smiles uses the image of a river to talk about this. A river does not cut through rock by trying harder. It cuts through rock by going the same way, every day, without stopping. The water is not strong. The rock is far harder than the water will ever be. But the water is consistent, and consistency over time is more powerful than almost anything else in the natural world. Your habits are the water. Your character is the canyon that forms. This is not a comfortable idea because it means there is no neutral. There is no such thing as a day where you are just coasting, not moving forward or backward, simply existing. Every single day, the habits you practice are either building the person you want to be, or they are quietly undermining that person. There is no standing still. The river is always moving. Now, from character and habit, Smiles moves into something that surprises a lot of people when they first encounter it in this book, and that is the importance of the body. In a book that is largely about the development of moral and mental character, Smiles devotes considerable attention to physical health, not because he was a fitness enthusiast, but because he understood something that is easy to forget when we are absorbed in the life of the mind or the life of the soul. We are embodied creatures. The state of our body affects the state of our mind, which affects the quality of our choices, which affects the direction of our character, which shapes the whole of our life. You cannot separate these things. They are a system. A tired body produces a tired mind, and a tired mind is more likely to take shortcuts, to lose patience, to give in to the impulses that the rested mind would easily resist. Smiles watched this play out in the lives of working people around him, men and women who were running on so little sleep, eating so poorly, working in such punishing conditions, that their capacity for the kind of clear, steady moral thinking he was describing was genuinely compromised, not because they lacked goodness, but because the instrument through which goodness acts, the human body and brain, was worn down to the point of near failure. He was not dismissive of this. He was genuinely sympathetic to it. But his response was not to lower the standard. His response was to say, take care of the instrument. Not as a luxury, but as a duty. Not because you deserve comfort, but because the work you are meant to do in this world requires you to be as functional as possible, and that requires you to honor the physical life you have been given. Sleep, fresh air, movement, moderation in eating and drinking, these were not indulgences in Smiles' view. They were the basic maintenance of a life well lived. And he noticed that the people who neglected this maintenance often paid for it not just in physical terms but in moral ones. The man who drinks too much loses not just his health but his reliability. The woman who never rests loses not just her energy but her kindness. The body and the character are more connected than we usually acknowledge, and Smiles wanted his readers to take that connection seriously. There is a passage in the book where he describes a laborer he once observed, a man who did some of the hardest physical work imaginable, who nonetheless maintained a kind of quiet dignity, a steadiness of temper, a gentleness with his family, that many men of far easier circumstances failed to achieve. And when Smiles looked at why, part of it was undeniably character, the man's deep sense of what he owed to those around him, but part of it was also physical. The man slept well. He ate simply but sufficiently. He did not drink. He was tired at the end of his days in the honest, clean way that hard physical labor produces, not the grinding, depleted, soul-eating exhaustion of someone running on fumes and anxiety. His body supported his character, and his character was expressed through a body that was cared for. This is the kind of integration Smiles was pointing toward. Moving from the body, Smiles turns to the mind, and here he talks about something he calls self-education, the habit of continuing to learn not because someone requires it of you, not because there is a test at the end, but because the development of your mind is one of the most important things you can do for yourself and for the people around you. He was writing in a time when formal education was not available to everyone, when many of the people he admired most had educated themselves entirely from books borrowed from libraries, from conversations with people wiser than themselves, from the patient work of thinking through problems and writing down what they found. And he argued that this kind of self-directed learning was in many ways more valuable than formal schooling, not because schools were bad, but because the discipline it took to educate yourself, to seek out knowledge when no one was forcing you to read when you could be doing something easier, to think carefully when careless thinking would do, that discipline was itself a form of character building. Think about that for a moment. Every time you choose to read something that challenges you instead of something that merely entertains you, you are doing two things at once. You are adding to your knowledge, yes, but you are also practicing the habit of reaching for something harder. And that habit, practiced consistently, makes you someone who reaches for the harder thing more naturally, in other contexts, in your work, in your relationships, in the way you approach problems. The act of learning is not separate from the act of becoming. They are the same act. Smiles talks about men and women who, despite working 10 or 12 hours a day, found time in the margins of their lives to read, to study, to learn languages or mathematics or history or science, not because they thought it would lead to a better job or a higher wage, though sometimes it did, but because they could not bear the idea of living their entire lives without expanding the boundaries of what they understood. There is something almost sacred in the way he describes these people. They had so little, in terms of time and money and opportunity, and yet they refused to accept the limit that their circumstances seemed to impose on their inner life. They built libraries inside themselves when they could not afford the books to fill a shelf. One story he tells is of a young woman working as a seamstress in conditions that were by any measure harsh, who spent her lunch breaks reading whatever she could get her hands on and her evenings teaching herself French from a grammar book she had saved for months to buy. No one asked her to do this. No one would reward her for it. The work was entirely invisible to the world. But she said something that Smiles records and that I find remarkable. She said that the hour she spent with her books at the end of a long day was the hour when she felt most fully herself. Most fully herself. Not when she was resting, not when she was being entertained, but when she was learning, when her mind was stretched and working and reaching towards something just beyond what it currently knew. That is a portrait of a fully alive human being, and it is a portrait that Smiles holds up as a model not because it is impressive, but because it is available to anyone. The hour at the end of the day is available to almost everyone. The question is only what you do with it. Now we come to something that Smiles treats with tremendous care, and that is the question of how we relate to other people, specifically the role that example plays in shaping a life. He believed, very deeply, that we are all constantly being formed by the people we spend time with, the people we admire, the people we choose as models. This is not a small thing. It is arguably one of the most powerful forces in the shaping of character, far more powerful than most of us realize, because it operates largely below the level of conscious awareness. You do not decide to adopt the mannerisms of your closest friend. It happens. You do not choose to absorb the attitudes of your workplace. It seeps in. You do not deliberately take on the values of your family. They are handed to you before you have the vocabulary to evaluate them. Smiles was not alarmed by this. He thought it was simply the truth about how human beings are made, and the response to it was not to try to become entirely self-sufficient, entirely immune to influence, but to choose your influences carefully, to be intentional about the examples you hold before yourself, to actively seek out the company and the stories of people whose character you admire, and to know that, in doing so, you are not just enjoying their company or learning from their experience, but actually allowing their example to quietly work on you, to pull you in a direction you want to go. He talks about the power of biography in this context, the reading of the lives of great men and women, not great in the sense of famous or powerful, but great in the sense of genuinely deeply good, people who faced difficulty and remained honest, people who were tempted and chose principle, people who had every reason to become bitter or hard and instead remained open and generous and kind. Reading these lives, he argued, was not merely educational, it was formative. It gave you a living image of what was possible, and that image, held in the mind and returned to in moments of difficulty, could be a source of real strength. Think about someone in your own life whose character you genuinely admire. Not their achievements, not their success, but their character, the way they handle disappointment, the patience they show, the honesty they maintain, the warmth they extend even to people who do not deserve it. Now think about how that person's example has shaped you, maybe not consciously, maybe not in ways you could easily articulate, but in the deep, quiet way that a good example works on a person over time. This is what Smiles is pointing to. The right example, held before us, works on us the way light works on a plant, not by forcing anything, but by making growth in a particular direction more likely. And then there is the other side of this coin, the danger of bad example, of surrounding yourself with cynicism, with dishonesty, with people who mock the things you value and normalize the things you know are wrong. Smiles was direct about this, not harsh, not self-righteous, but plain. The company you keep is the garden you grow in. You cannot spend your hours with people who erode your values and expect those values to remain strong. This is not a judgment about those people. It is simply an honest account of how we human beings actually work. Permeable, absorptive, shaped by what is around us far more than we like to think. There is a story here that Smiles does not tell directly, but that the whole shape of his argument implies, and it is the story of two young men who grew up in the same street, the same poverty, the same limited opportunities. One of them spent his evenings in the company of men who complained, who blamed, who found comfort in small vices and smaller ambitions. The other found his way, through something like luck or instinct or hunger, into the orbit of a man who had built something, not wealth, not fame, but a life of genuine substance, who read and thought and held himself to a standard and treated people with respect. These two young men, starting from the same place, ended up in lives so different that you might never guess they had begun from the same street. The difference was not talent, it was not luck, it was example, and the willingness to let the right example work on you. From the question of example and influence, Smiles moves into a discussion of temperament, of the emotional life, and this is where the book becomes particularly rich and, in places, quietly beautiful. He talks about the importance of what he calls equanimity, a steadiness of spirit that is not the same as not having emotions, but is something like having a home inside yourself that the weather cannot entirely destroy. People who have this, he observes, are not made of stone. They feel grief and frustration and fear as acutely as anyone else, but they have developed, through practice and through something like faith, a stability at the core that allows them to feel these things without being entirely undone by them. The storm comes, they bend, but they do not break. And when the storm passes, they are still standing, still themselves, still capable of the next good thing. He is honest that this is not easily achieved. It is the work of years, not days. And it is not achieved by suppressing emotion or pretending difficulty does not exist. It is achieved by doing, consistently, the things that build a stable inner life, the habits of thought that tilt toward gratitude rather than resentment, the practice of putting problems in perspective, the discipline of not catastrophizing, of not assuming that today's difficulty is tomorrow's permanent condition. These are not tricks, they are capacities, and like all capacities, they are developed through exercise. There is a woman he writes about, a woman who lost her husband when their children were young, who faced a level of practical difficulty that would have broken many people, and whose response to that difficulty was so extraordinary that Smiles uses her as a portrait of what the fully developed character looks like under pressure. She did not pretend to be fine. She was not fine, not for a long time. She grieved honestly, openly, in the way that grief deserves to be grieved. But she never let the grief become an identity. She never let the hardness of her circumstances become permission to treat people around her badly. She maintained a gentleness with her children, a patience with difficult neighbors, a humor, sometimes a painful humor, about the gap between the life she had planned and the life she was living. And over time, her children grew into people of extraordinary character, not despite the difficulty of their circumstances, but partly because of the example their mother had set in how she carried those circumstances. The way she handled her pain taught them how to handle theirs. Smiles believes strongly in what might be called the legacy of conduct, the idea that how you live, the character you embody or fail to embody, is not just about you. It ripples. It moves through time in ways you will never fully see or know. The mother who is patient teaches patience to children who will teach it to their children. The man who keeps his word creates an atmosphere of trustworthiness that makes it easier for the people around him to do the same. The teacher who genuinely cares about her students plants seeds in them that will grow in directions she will never witness. And conversely, the parent who is cruel or careless, the employer who is dishonest, the friend who is unreliable, these too leave a legacy, one that spreads in ways that were perhaps never intended but are no less real for that. This is one of the most sobering ideas in the book, and also one of the most beautiful, because it means that the small things matter enormously. The kindness you offer to someone you will never see again. The honesty you practice when dishonesty would be undetectable. The patience you hold on to when no one would blame you for losing it. These things move through the world in ways that cannot be tracked or measured, but that are absolutely real. You are, every single day, contributing to the character of the human world you live in. The question is only what you are contributing. Moving further into the book, Smiles addresses something he considers central to a life well lived, and that is the relationship between duty and happiness. This is where many modern readers might feel a slight friction, because we live in a culture that talks constantly about happiness, about finding your passion, about living your best life, about feeling good. Smiles does not dismiss happiness. He values it genuinely. But he argues that the people who are most durably happy, who have a happiness that does not depend on circumstances being favorable, who carry their contentment like something built into the structure of their spine rather than something they have to go out and find, are almost always people who have made their peace with duty. People who find satisfaction not primarily in what pleases them, but in what they owe. There is a freedom in this that is not obvious until you have lived it a little. When your happiness depends on external conditions, you are at the mercy of a world you cannot control. When it depends on the performance of your duty, on being the person you are committed to being regardless of what is happening around you, it becomes much more stable. Much harder to take away. The man who is kind because he feels like being kind today is not reliably kind. The man who is kind because he believes it is what the situation calls for, because it is what he owes to the person in front of him, that man is kind in the moments when kindness matters most, which are usually the moments when it costs the most and when he feels least like offering it. Smiles is careful to say that duty does not mean self-erasure. It does not mean the sacrifice of your own well-being to the point of destruction. It means the recognition that you are not the only one in the room, that you are not the only one whose needs count, that part of what it means to be fully human is to live in the awareness that other people are real and that what you do affects them. Duty is love made reliable. It is care made consistent. It is the daily practice of actually being the person you hope others see when they think of you. He tells a story about a doctor, a country doctor, who had the kind of practice that meant long hours, bad weather, insufficient pay, and patients who sometimes took for granted the care they received. By any reasonable measure, this man had grounds for complaint. He did not complain. He had, over years of practice, arrived at something that Smiles calls a sense of vocation, a sense that the work he was doing was not just a job, but a genuine service to real people whose lives were genuinely affected by how he did it. And this sense of vocation, this feeling that the work mattered and that therefore doing it well mattered, transformed the experience of the work entirely. The same long hours were not the same hours when felt as vocation rather than obligation. The same difficult patients were not the same patients when seen as real human beings in real distress rather than inconveniences. The meaning changed the experience, even when the facts of the experience did not change at all. This is something Smiles returns to in various forms throughout the book, this question of how meaning transforms experience. The work itself matters less than the relationship you bring to the work. The circumstances of your life matter less than the spirit in which you inhabit those circumstances. This is not positive thinking in the shallow sense. It is not pretending that difficult things are fine. It is the recognition that two people can live in near identical circumstances and have completely different lives depending on the meaning they bring to what they are living. The meaning is not given, it is made, and the making of it is one of the most important forms of human freedom. As we move toward the middle of this journey through Smiles' ideas, now is a good moment to pause and really absorb what we have covered so far, because if you have been listening, if you have really been letting these ideas land, you might have noticed something. We are not talking about extraordinary things. We're not talking about the lives of saints or heroes or people with gifts that the rest of us simply do not have. We are talking about habits, about how you carry your body, about what you read, about who you choose to be around, about the gap between duty and desire and what it means to close that gap with dignity. These are the most ordinary things in the world, and Smiles is saying, quietly, persistently, that these ordinary things, done consistently with attention and intention, are the material from which a genuinely good life is made. If you are finding this useful, if you are finding that these ideas are sparking something in you, please take a moment right now, pause and hit the like button, and if you are not already subscribed, subscribe to Audiobook Library. It is a small thing that makes a real difference to whether this channel can keep growing and keep bringing you content like this. Your support genuinely helps. Now, let us continue. Smiles turns next to a topic that sits at the heart of everything he believes about conduct, and that is truthfulness and the closely related virtue of sincerity. He is not talking about brutal honesty, the kind that uses truth as a weapon, that confuses cruelty with candor. He is talking about a deeper orientation toward reality, a commitment to living without the constant performance of being something other than what you are, a refusal to build your relationships on foundations of impression management and strategic self-presentation. This is harder than it sounds, because the pressure to perform, to present a version of yourself that is more impressive, more confident, more successful, more sorted than you actually are, is constant and comes from everywhere. Smiles observed that the most exhausting people to spend time with were not the most demanding or the most difficult. They were the most performative, the people who were always curating their image, always speaking for effect, always managing how they were being perceived. These people required a kind of constant translation from what they were saying to what was actually true, and over time, that translation work became unbearable. The people who were simply themselves, who said what they meant and meant what they said, who did not pretend to certainty they did not have or enthusiasm they did not feel, these people were, paradoxically, much easier to be around, much more nourishing to spend time with, even when their honesty was sometimes uncomfortable. There is a kind of courage required for sincerity, and Smiles acknowledges this directly. To be genuinely honest about what you know and what you do not know, about what you believe and what you are not sure of, about what you feel and what you are struggling with, requires a willingness to be vulnerable that does not come easily to most people. We are trained, from very early, to perform confidence, to project competence, to hide weakness. And some of that training is not entirely wrong. There is a time and a place for professional composure. But when it becomes the entire mode of operation, when sincerity itself becomes something you can no longer access, something has gone deeply wrong, not just relationally, but inside you. The person who has lost the ability to be genuinely honest with the people closest to them has lost something important, something that is very hard to get back once it is gone. Smiles tells of two businessmen who had been partners for years. One was a master of impression management, always presenting the picture of confidence and competence, always knowing the right thing to say to inspire trust. The other was quieter, less polished, sometimes awkward in the way that genuinely honest people can be awkward, but invariably accurate. When he said something, it was because he believed it. When he said he did not know, he genuinely did not know. When he expressed concern, it was real concern, not a negotiating position. Over the years, without either man fully registering it, the trust that the people around them extended shifted entirely toward the second man. Not because he was more impressive, but because he was more real. The first man had more charm, the second man had more credibility, and in the long run, credibility is worth incomparably more. This is one of Smiles' deepest convictions, that in the long run, the genuinely honest person, the person of real integrity, has an advantage so enormous that it dwarfs almost any other quality. Because integrity compounds. Every time you keep your word becomes worth more. Every time you tell an uncomfortable truth when a comfortable lie would have served you better, you add to a store of trust that you are building with the world. And that trust, over years, over decades, becomes one of the most valuable things a person can possess, not because it is a strategy, but because it is simply the natural outcome of being reliably who you say you are. From sincerity, Smiles moves naturally into a discussion of the relationship between outer conduct and inner life, and this is where the book becomes almost philosophical in its depth, though it never loses its practical grounding. He is interested in the question of whether a person can be consistently good on the outside without being genuinely good on the inside. Can you perform virtue long enough that it becomes real? Or does genuine virtue require a certain kind of inner alignment that no performance can substitute for? His answer is nuanced. He believes, with the evidence of human experience behind him, that behavior does shape character over time. The man who acts with patience, even when he does not feel patient, is gradually, through that practice, becoming a more patient person. The woman who forces herself to speak kindly when she would prefer to be cutting is, through that practice, cultivating a genuine gentleness that was not there before. In this sense, the outside does work on the inside, and the practice of virtue, even imperfect virtue, even virtue that feels effortful and unnatural, is a real form of character development and not mere performance. This is important because it means that you do not have to wait until you feel like being good to practice being good. The practice itself is transformative. But he also insists on the necessity of what he calls moral sincerity, the alignment of motive with action, the practice not just of doing the right thing, but of working to want the right thing, of interrogating your own reasons, of not being satisfied with good behavior that masks ugly motives. The person who is generous only to be admired is not cultivating generosity. They are cultivating vanity dressed in generous clothes. The person who is honest only when honesty serves their interests has not built a character of integrity. They have built a character of convenience. Real virtue requires the ongoing work of making sure the inside and the outside are genuinely moving together, that the conduct is an expression of the character and not a substitute for it. He suggests that the clearest test of this alignment is how you behave when no one is watching, when there is no audience, no reward, no consequence for cutting corners. What do you do then? The person who acts with the same care and integrity in the empty room as they do in the full one has achieved something genuinely impressive, something that most people spend their whole lives moving toward without quite arriving. But the direction matters as much as the destination. The person who is trying to close the gap between who they are in public and who they are in private, who is genuinely working to make their private self worthy of their public one, is on the right path, even if they have not yet arrived. Smiles now addresses the question of adversity, of difficulty, of how we meet the hard things that life inevitably brings, and this is one of the most human sections of the entire book. He does not minimize suffering. He does not offer the cold comfort of telling people that their difficulties are blessings in disguise, though he does believe, carefully and without naivety, that difficulty handled well can produce something valuable. What he insists on is that difficulty is not optional. It is part of the structure of a human life. Everyone who has lived long enough has their share of it. The question is never whether you will face it. The question is only what kind of person you will be when you do. He talks about what he calls the education of adversity, the way that hard things, when met with the right spirit, have the capacity to develop in us qualities that easier circumstances simply cannot produce. Patience is not developed in easy conditions. It is developed in exactly the conditions where it is hardest to maintain it. Compassion is not built in the absence of pain. It is built in the presence of your own pain, which, when honestly felt and honestly processed, opens you to the pain of others in a way that nothing else can. The capacity to persist, To keep going when everything in you wants to stop, that is not built on the easy days. It is built in the crucible of the days when keeping going costs you something real. There is a story that Smiles does not tell, but that his words make me think of, the story of a woman who lost her child. There is no preparing for something like that. There is no philosophy that takes the edge off it, no character so strong that it does not bend almost to breaking. This woman bent. She was barely recognizable for months, hollowed out by a grief that is simply one of the worst things a human being can experience. But over time, slowly, the way the light returns after the longest nights, she came back. Not to who she had been before, because that person was gone, and pretending otherwise would have been false to the reality of what she had lost. She came back as someone different, someone who had been to the bottom of human sorrow and come back carrying something, a depth of compassion, an unwillingness to waste the time she had left, a gratitude for small things that she had never felt before with such intensity. The grief had not made her better. Grief does not do that on its own. But her willingness to go into the grief honestly, to not run from it, to let it do its work on her, that had made her someone who lived differently, more fully, more gently, more attentively in the years that followed. Smiles would recognize this woman. She is, in her own quiet way, an example of what he means when he talks about the education of adversity. Not the adversity itself, which is simply painful, but the choice to meet it with a spirit that allows it to develop rather than destroy. That choice, even in the worst circumstances, is still a choice. It is perhaps the most important choice available to a human being. Toward the latter half of the book, Smiles turns to what he considers one of the most undermined and undervalued virtues in public and private life, and that is self-control. Not repression, not the suppression of everything spontaneous or passionate in you. Self-control in his sense is the capacity to choose your response rather than simply having your response chosen for you by habit, impulse, or external circumstance. It is the gap between stimulus and response, the pause between what happens to you and what you do about it, and the ability to use that pause wisely. He observes that most of the regrets people carry in their lives, most of the harm they have done to their relationships, their reputations, their own sense of who they are, come from moments when they lost this capacity. The angry word spoken in the heat of a moment that cannot be taken back. The decision made in a state of frustration that looked entirely different when the frustration passed. The temptation yielded to, not because it was chosen, but because the defenses were down and the impulse was strong, and in that particular moment, there was no gap between the want and the action. These are the moments that haunt people. These are the moments they would give almost anything to have back. And Smiles does not say this with judgment. He says it with something closer to compassion because he understands that these moments are not aberrations. They are what happens when self-control is undeveloped. And self-control is undeveloped in almost everyone to some degree because it is hard to develop. Because it requires you to act against the grain of what feels natural in the moment when acting against the grain is least possible. This is the central difficulty of self-control. The moments when it is most needed are exactly the moments when it is hardest to access. His answer is practice, but practice before the moment of crisis, not during it. You cannot develop self-control in the moment when you have already lost it. You develop it in the ordinary days, in the small daily opportunities to choose your response rather than surrendering it, in the tiny moments of pause before reacting, in the habit of asking yourself before speaking or acting, is this what I would choose? Or is this just what I happen to be feeling right now? These small practices, repeated daily, build the capacity that will be available in the larger moments, when the stakes are higher and the need is greater. He tells a story of a young man with a ferocious temper, a man who had, by his early 20s, damaged nearly every important relationship in his life through outbursts that he genuinely regretted afterward but could not seem to prevent in the moment. He had been told by everyone who cared about him that he needed to change, and he agreed, but agreement had not been enough. The temper kept returning and returning and returning. What finally changed things for him was not a resolution, it was a practice. He began every single morning to observe before doing anything else 3 things he was grateful for. Not because gratitude would make the anger go away, but because this daily practice of consciously choosing where to direct his attention began to build, over months and years, a different kind of relationship with his own inner states. He became, slowly, less entirely at the mercy of his emotions, more able to observe them from a slight distance, more capable of the pause between the feeling and the action. The temper did not disappear, but it stopped running his life. He began, for the first time, to run it himself. This is a small story, but it carries something important, the insight that character change does not usually happen through dramatic conversion. It happens through the patient, daily practice of small alternatives to the habits you are trying to break. You do not defeat a bad habit by fighting it directly. You defeat it by building, in its place, a better one until the better one is strong enough to hold the ground. Smiles also writes, with genuine warmth, about the virtue of kindness, and here the book becomes almost tender in its quality. He has been talking throughout about discipline, about duty, about habit and self-control, and these are genuinely important, but he is careful to situate all of them within a larger vision of human life, in which kindness is not a soft addition but a central value. A person who has all the discipline in the world but no genuine warmth toward others has not achieved what Smiles is pointing toward. Character, in his understanding, is not primarily about being impressive. It is about being good, and goodness, in the deepest sense, is inseparable from genuine care for others. He talks about kindness not as the performance of kind acts, though that matters, but as a quality of attention, the ability and willingness to actually see the people around you, to notice when someone is struggling, to remember that every person you meet is carrying something, a burden that may not be visible but is no less real for being invisible. Kindness in this sense is a form of seeing. It is the refusal to treat people as mere furniture in the landscape of your own life, as obstacles or instruments or background noise. It is the practice of recognizing in each person you encounter a full human being whose reality is as complex and as important as your own. He gives an example that is so simple it is almost embarrassing, the kind of example that makes you think, yes, obviously, and yet also makes you wonder how often you actually do it. A man is walking down the street and sees a neighbor who looks tired and gray. He has two options. He can nod and pass, which is perfectly polite, and in some moods is exactly what the neighbor would want. Or he can stop for a moment and say, "You look like you are carrying something heavy today. Is there anything I can do?" That is the whole example. The stopping. The actual noticing. The small offer that may amount to nothing more than a conversation, but that communicates to another human being that they have been seen, that their struggle is real to someone else, that they are not entirely alone in it. Smiles believed, and I think he was right, that the cumulative effect of this kind of attention, in a life, in a community, in a society, is incalculable. We are made better by being seen. We are made more capable of goodness by experiencing kindness. It compounds, the way interest compounds, slowly, invisibly, and then suddenly you look at the total and it is much larger than you realized. There is also in this section something that Smiles says about kindness to oneself, and it is worth pausing on because it is a point that the whole framework of character building can sometimes obscure. All this talk of discipline, duty, habit, self-control, it can sound punishing, can make it seem like the virtuous life is a life of constant severity toward yourself. But Smiles is clear that this is not what he means. He believes in rest. He believes in pleasure, in the genuine enjoyment of the beautiful things the world offers. He believes that a life lived entirely in the strains of duty, without joy, without lightness, without the particular kind of laughter that comes from not taking yourself too seriously, is a diminished life, not a virtuous one. The fully developed character is not the character that never relaxes. It is the character that has earned its rest, that can be fully present in a moment of joy without guilt, that can be moved by beauty without embarrassment, that has the spaciousness to be delighted by things simply because they are delightful. The discipline is in the service of this capacity, not opposed to it. You build the capacity for joy by not letting the small vices and easy indulgences erode your ability to feel the real thing. You earn the deep rest by doing the real work. The character Smiles admires most is not austere. It is full, rich, alive, capable of all the human experiences in their proper measure, and that includes the experience of being simply, genuinely, uncomplicated happy. As we approach the final stretches of this journey through Samuel Smiles' life and conduct, there is one more set of ideas that deserves real attention, and it concerns the relationship between the individual and the world beyond themselves. Smiles was not a man who believed in pure individualism. He did not think the development of character was something you did for yourself alone, or that the virtuous life was simply a private achievement. He believed deeply in the social fabric, in the idea that each person who develops genuine character is a contribution to the world they live in, that the ripples of a well-lived life extend far beyond the life itself, and that the project of becoming a better person is, in a very real sense, the same project as making a better world. He was not naive about institutions or politics. He did not think you could legislate character into people. He believed, with a clarity that remains relevant, that the improvement of society was inseparable from the improvement of individuals, that you could not build trustworthy institutions out of untrustworthy people, that you could not have a just society if the individuals composing it had no serious investment in justice at the personal level. This is not a conservative argument against social change. It is an argument for the irreducibility of personal responsibility within whatever structural changes you are working for. Both matter. The system matters, and the individual matters, and the mistake is to think that improving one is a substitute for improving the other. He talks about what a community of genuinely characterful people would look like, and it is a vision of extraordinary warmth and practicality combined. It would be a community where promises were kept, where debts were honored, where people told each other the truth even when it was difficult, where hardship was met with genuine communal support rather than judgment, where the standard of conduct was not set by law or fear of consequence, but by a genuine, internalized sense of what was owed to others and what was owed to oneself. This is not a utopia. It is a direction. It is the direction in which every small act of genuine character pushes the world, however slightly, however imperceptibly. And then Smiles makes a final argument that I want to end with, because it is the one that ties everything together. He says, in essence, that the greatest thing a person can give to the world is not their talent or their intelligence or their achievements, as valuable as those may be. The greatest thing they can give is the example of a well-lived life, the example of a person who faced difficulty and remained honest, who was tested by temptation and chose principle, who had every reason to become bitter and chose gratitude instead, who treated the people around them with consistent, unglamorous, unphotographed kindness, who built, over the course of a lifetime, a character that the people who knew them could hold up as evidence that it is possible to be genuinely, durably, simply good. This is the legacy that cannot be taken away. Not wealth which can be lost, not reputation which can be destroyed by a single bad day, not power which passes, but the example of a life honestly and well lived that is permanent, that moves through the world in the lives of everyone who witnessed it, who was touched by it, who was quietly formed by it in ways they may never be able to fully articulate. The young man who remembers how his grandfather handled the loss of everything he owned and who draws on that memory when he faces his own losses. The student who never forgot the teacher who believed in her when she did not believe in herself. The child who grows up and discovers in a moment of crisis that they have access to a patience or a courage that they did not know they had, and who eventually understands that it was given to them, unknowingly, by someone who practiced it daily in their presence. This is the world that Smiles is pointing toward, a world made better not by great dramatic gestures, but by the steady accumulation of small good acts performed by people who have taken seriously the work of becoming who they most deeply want to be. If you have stayed with this all the way through, if you have let these ideas work on you, if you are leaving this experience with even one thought that you did not have when you began, then something real has happened here, and that is worth something. Samuel Smiles wrote his book in the belief that ideas have power, that words carefully offered to an honest reader can shift something, can tip a balance, can make a next step slightly more possible than it was before. That belief across all the years between his life and yours still holds. Take whatever has stayed with you, take it into your day, take it into the small choices that no one will see and that will shape quietly, imperceptibly, the direction of who you are becoming. Because that is where the real work is done. Not in the dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones. Not in the grand gestures, but in the daily practice. Not in who you are when the whole world is watching, but in who you are when the only one watching is you. And please, if you found value in this, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps this channel grow and keeps making it possible to bring you more of this kind of content. It takes only a moment, and it means more than you might think. Also, please do check out the other videos on this channel. There is a whole library of summaries and audiobooks waiting for you, and you never know which one might have exactly the idea you need to hear right now. Thank you, deeply, for your time and your attention. They are among the most valuable things you have.